Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Matthew chapter 6. Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single day to your life? And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own.
Well, it's a very good morning to everybody. It's lovely to be here. And I'm glad to see this topic, that you've got a little mini-series going on. That is to say that you were looking at how to handle stress last week, and going on to look at handling fear next week. And I've got looking at handling anxiety this morning. So, you probably appreciate that as you stand here in front of a group of people, you feel a bit anxious. It's normal. I feel a bit nervous about doing it, and that's absolutely normal. Those three words that we've used there, stress and anxiety and fear, I think it's fair to say that all of us can relate to in different ways. They're very tied up together. And even if I was to say to you, how are you feeling today? I'm sure I'd get a whole variety of responses. There would be those that feel a bit more vulnerable and a bit more, they hold their emotions on their sleeves and they're quite happy to say, this is how I'm feeling this morning. There would be some of you here today who actually wouldn't want to answer that question, or you might just find a middle way of just saying, yeah, I'm fine, thanks. I always find it interesting when you talk to people during the week and you just ask them how they're feeling. And if you're not expecting to spend a bit of time talking to them and listening to what they have to say, I'm not sure it's a really good question to ask, because in my experience, I'm not sure how honest we are when that kind of thing is. We know it's part of our culture. We know that it's quite normal to ask how people are. But it's a really important thing just to check in, sort of like day by day. And I want to sort of like issue a bit of a disclaimer at this point, because I want to stand here and say quite honestly that this has been something that I've found really difficult over my time on planet Earth, thinking about emotional and mental health. It's not something that I particularly handled well. I grew up in a generation where mum and dad were part of the war years. They didn't talk about stuff that happened to them. So consequently, them asking me how I felt was a non-question. And I found that, I didn't find it difficult because I didn't even know that it was something that was important. So I think it's very obvious that has an impact on and a bearing on how we go through life. And so I stand here, quite honestly, to say mental health has been a challenge for me in my life. There are things that I've learned quite late in life. There are things that I've been quite ignorant of until I actually hit a wall. And now I used to run marathons a lot. And when somebody says, when you hit the wall, it's a physical reality that when you run and you run out of those glycogen reserves, those energy reserves, you literally hit a wall. So if you see somebody doing it, they haven't got any control over their body. both body and mind. It's a horrible feeling to go through. Now, I hit one of those walls back in 2010. And just to give you a bit of context, those of you that know me, I've got 2 children. They're both grown up now. I've got a 28-year-old son called Callum, who at just over 2 was diagnosed with autism. He's non-verbal. He's somebody that has never been able to communicate sort of with words. So we've actually gone through a journey ourselves of not really knowing kind of like what he's feeling a lot of the time. So in a way, he was a living example of trying to understand, trying to appreciate what his feelings were. And when we talk about fear, we talk about a normal feeling, which is actually good for us. When we think about fear, we think about the fact that when we have that word in our mind, it attends to something that's going on that is real for us. It's something that makes us become hypervigilant, makes us kind of like aware of our surroundings in a much more condensed form, a much more real form. It's needed because it kind of like keeps us kind of like safe. And what I've discovered, and I think my wife would say the same thing, is that when we had that diagnosis, we buried a lot of stuff. We said, it's fine, God's with us. Okay, we'll get through this, okay. But the reality is that actually what we were in was what was called a hypervigilant state. In other words, we were constantly on the lookout, constantly looking out for his safety, for our safety. And in a way, it kind of like framed the next, I don't know how many years. It's much better now because I've had to work through it. But there was something about being hypervigilant, which was a horrible feeling to have. It was something where it kind of meant that our sort of physical resources were constantly on the go. It had an impact on physical health. It does. It's almost inevitable. I'll say a bit more about that in a second. But that's a reality. What I was really loving about looking at that second passage was that the Bible is not unrealistic about the things we go through. I mean, it talks about each day has a trouble of its own. And I don't need to say that to you. You know that there are, your own challenges that you face. And that's not ignoring the fact that there are no troubles. There are troubles. But I guess it's how we approach the troubles that we have. So I thought I'd just sort of like introduce the context, the anxiety topic this morning by just saying it's somewhere I've trodden. It's somewhere that I'm constantly grappling with. It's something where I understand that to be whole, to be saved by Jesus, is something that is an ongoing work. We use that word sanctification, about being made holy throughout the course of our life. It's something that we need. We need to be healed. There are things that God is attending to us at different stages in our life. So anxiety is no different in that respect. And I'm grateful for today because I think mental health is something where there's been huge advances in the world of neuroscience, that is to say the study of the brain, and also how the Christian community approaches mental health. It's not something that we should be afraid of. It's an intrinsic part of who we are as human beings. We've seen the growth in wisdom, and we've seen that often the Christian community has moved away from simplistic answers about a topic such as anxiety and mental health. I'm grateful of that. I remember when I was doing theological training some years ago, it was quite a long time ago now, there was a phrase that people used, against counselling for the Bible. And when I started to learn that, there was a school of thought within the Christian circles which was, just ignore counselling. It's got nothing to say to you. Go for the Bible. And I found that over the course of time that was problematic. I do believe that counselling is an important and integral part of dealing with mental health. And we can do that in a godly way. So I'm grateful for that this morning. So we've got this word anxiety. And you might have a different definition of it. There's one definition which is that it can be described as a feeling of apprehension or dread in situations where there's no actual real threat and is disproportionate to the situation faced. I think about Monday morning. I don't know what you're like on Monday morning, but Monday morning I get Monday morning feeling. And my Monday morning looks like being in school with a bunch of secondary school students who are, who I find challenging at times. That's my prospect, sort of like tomorrow morning I'll be at school at 8 o'clock in the morning, getting ready to sort of meet with young people, which I love. But actually, I know that even sort of like towards the end of the afternoon, I start to feel that sense of, well, there's a bit of anxiety there. Have I prepared properly for what I'm going to be doing? Have I got the resources that I need? We know that there's something that's coming on our horizon. But unlike stress, I think anxiety persists even after that concern has passed. We often feel those symptoms of physical anxiety afterwards. It's quite normal when we get afraid of something that we have those physical realities, but the body in time, if it's working in a healthy way, will start to kind of like modify and control those levels, whether that would be different hormone levels or sort of other physical symptoms that we get in stress. And we know it at its extreme that it can lead to anxiety disorders. We talk about those people that sort of like suffer from that, and that's not an easy thing to do. I remember when I was in a really bad way, having panic attacks. Now, if you say to anybody about having a panic attack, just don't worry, it will go away. Panic attacks are horrible. They really are a horrible physical symptom. You think you're having a heart attack. You think there's something that's not it's not just about shaking, but you suddenly feel that all these symptoms that could sort of like almost feel like there's something more serious going on. And we know at that point that, it's important to try and ground ourselves if we can do, to say, actually, it's okay. Let's just sort of, physically touch this lectern to make sure that, that we're with other people. So anxiety is something that can escalate for sure. Like I said, it's a feeling of apprehension or worry about situations that we face in our lives. But it's normal. It's normal to face periods of anxiety. It's normal to have feelings when you go into an exam or you have a test at school or you're going for a job interview. There is a sense in which those things are normal. There's a place for, almost like for getting us ready for performance, I guess. That's probably one way of looking at it. And it's like I say, it's normal. And there are, like I say, there are different things that happen to different people in families where, anxiety can be exacerbated, for sure. And we find different ways to try to address anxiety. And that sometimes can be through other forms of, it could be medication or it could be alcohol or drugs. Incidentally, taking medication, I think, is a really good thing for people that do struggle with anxiety. I would never decry that for a moment. I think it's good to work with medical professions around some anxiety where it can help. But I think talking is equally as important. So we can differentiate between fear and anxiety, for sure. If we go back to that fear feeling that we can have, we talk a lot about fight, flight or freeze. We realise that actually, that makes sense. It does make sense, for us to be prepared for danger. Our bodies are addressing a perceived threat, and that's normal. And in time, we get to appreciate what some of those symptoms are, those physical symptoms, whether that's breathing speeding up or heart's beating faster, or our eyes focusing much more, our adrenaline flooding our system, whatever that might be. But we know in time that when the perceived threat is not there, that actually our body resorts to an equilibrium. We don't need to have that hypervigilance anymore. And so we can, like I say, differentiate between both fear and anxiety by recognising that fear is an intense biological response to an immediate danger, whilst anxiety is an emotion regarding things we think may happen. Okay, so I think that's quite a helpful definition. Anxiety can be less focused and immediate than fear, and it can often be vague and more fixated on things that may or may not happen. But as I said before, it's important to understand that anxiety is not something that we can just dismiss. It's debilitating if you suffer from it. It does resort to some strange symptoms sometimes. And I think the other thing to say about anxiety is that, and we need to be realistic about this, is that it can be associated with prior trauma and prior experience. And I think that's something really helpful to appreciate. We don't know what those traumas may be in other people. We don't always know what that trauma might be in ourselves. we sort of come to appreciate more as we get to know ourselves more, that there perhaps is more going on. And for that reason, I think talking therapies, I would absolutely say, are crucial. And we need to pray for our counsellors and for those that deal with mental health. But as we look at biblical texts this morning, I think it's really important to look at a couple, and I've put a couple up just now. It's easy for us to take things out of context. It's easy for us to sort of almost reduce texts to a very simplistic form. And that can often induce anxiety in others when we get those responses that we can give to people. So we have to handle them really carefully. And so you'll probably notice that the first one that I looked at was Philippians 4 and verses 5 to 7. And let me repeat this to you again. The Lord is near. And then it goes on to say, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Now, the thing I love about this section is that you have those very simple words, the Lord is near. Sometimes when we feel that level of anxiety, we kind of dismiss in our mind the even possibility that God is with us. We can feel very alone. And yet the reassurance of this passage is that God is near us. He's at very close proximity. I love the Psalms. As I've become more self-aware, I love to go to the Psalms because the Psalms are real. The Psalms explain emotions in every situation. They don't dismiss them out of hand. And the person that speaks often is being very real. And often you think, how can they be like that? They're supposed to know God. How can they talk like that? How can David talk like that? But that's the beautiful thing about the Psalms. And I think this is such an encouragement. The Lord is with us. It does say next, do not be anxious about anything. Okay, and that's the challenge. But again, then it's very realistic because it says go in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And I think that's such an important thing to do. We need to do that regularly. Part of a spiritual discipline. Go to God in prayer because God is near. What I really love about that is the fact that, we can go straight into the problem, the anxiety that we're feeling, but it says with thanksgiving. We can frame it in terms of, well, actually, there is a lot to be grateful for. There's a lot to be thankful for. It's putting things into a real context. And I love that. Gratitude is something that can really bubble up. It can make a difference. It impacts on others around us as well as ourselves. And so we do it with thanksgiving. We're honest with God about the things that we're struggling with. We're honest with those days when we don't want to get out of bed. When we're thinking, what on earth is going on in my body? Why am I, approaching things like this? It doesn't feel very rational. And the other thing that seems to be very evident from this is that, it talks about the fact that the peace of God will guard our hearts and our minds. We can't differentiate between our bodies and our physical mind or whatever's going on in this funny, skull up here. We're integrated. We're a whole. We're human beings. And that's what I love about neuroscience, because I think neuroscience explains so much more to me about, what's going on in this skull of mine. One of the things that I found really, really helpful was just thinking about, when we have those feelings of anger, for example, anger can flood our systems. And before we know it, we're going off and doing something that we might afterwards regret, or maybe we won't regret it. But the thing is, this brain, the front of our brain, our prefrontal cortex goes offline often when we get flooded with those emotions. And it's very difficult at that point to act rationally. No, when we're thinking about God's peace, we're thinking about the fact that God is guarding both our hearts and our minds. And we should pray for that. We should pray for that wisdom that we have in every situation, because each day has trouble of its own. So we need to appreciate that we were created as people that have emotions, and we need to praise God for those emotions. And we need to actually acknowledge what those emotions might be. They cannot be ignored. If we ignore our emotions, we will get ourselves in all kinds of trouble. And anxiety is no different in that. We are to attend to them for sure. And back to, the God who is near. The God who is near is the God of peace. The God of peace? We don't have a full expression of what peace looks like. Peace is a word that we bandy around quite a bit. But when we go back to the Old Testament teaching, peace is something which is so much more than salvation. It's salvation for sure. But it's about healing. It's about wholeness. About Rapha wholeness. It's about restoration, completeness, living at one with our God, which is lovely. One of my favourite passages in the Old Testament is of Hagar with her little boy Ishmael. And I think about the experience of that woman who was, she wasn't guiltless in what she did, but she was somebody that was abused. She was somebody that was very poorly treated. And she goes into the wilderness and she begins to wonder or despair of life itself. And we hear about the God there being the God who sees her, the God who notices her. And he doesn't automatically say, I'm going to make your situation easier. What does God say? He says, go back. You've got things to do. But God is a God who sees her. And so when we think about that proximity, we think about in Philippians where it talks about the Lord being near. The God sees us. Our God sees us. He notices us. We can think back to Genesis when the man and woman are walking in the garden. God knows where they are. God sees them. He notices. He wants a connection with them, which is so vital. So there's a lot to take encouragement from in that first little passage. And we then went on to look at another passage in Matthew. And I wanted to just sort of think about this in terms of anxiety. Because, it's very easy for us to sort of create some trite and some simplistic responses. But it is good for us to think about our natural world. It's good for us to be able to see how God honours, how God looks after our creation. And so when we think about those necessities of life, eating and drinking, what we wear, they are important to us for sure. But God there attributes this thinking to the birds of the air, the grass in the fields. You think about the birds in the air. I'm very grateful for the fact I've got a little garden that I'm able to look out onto early in the morning. And I love to look at the little birds in the plum tree. We have a plum tree. We're really grateful for that. It's one plum tree that has produced so much fruit over the years. But that place is a place of rest and of nourishment for those little birds. And so, the passage here talks about the simple things of life that apply to the created order of whom we are, if you like, the pinnacle, I guess, as human beings. And it raises those questions, in our minds about worry and about what shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we wear? And that's common. That's a common lot to everybody on planet Earth, never mind us as people of faith. And the Bible writer is very realistic. We've got things going on now, and we're going to have things going on tomorrow. But let's put things in context. Let's recognise that actually there is enough going on. But not only that, but God actually does care about our situation. He's not dismissing it out of hand. He's just talking about context. And the context is about seeking God's kingdom. It's about putting God first. It's about recognising, okay, he has his priorities and he won't leave us without. And I think that's such an important, very easily overlooked principle, that God has us in mind. So we're talking here about that window that our hearts look through to consider our purpose and our priorities. In other words, who or what do we trust? Who or what is our object of worship? And we could go off on any number of different sermons about putting God first and about not substituting God for idols. But those priorities are important. Brené Brown is quite a well-known writer that has done a lot of academic research. I love Brené Brown. If you get a chance to see a book called Atlas of the Heart, I would commend it to you. Brené Brown has written a lot about feelings. And what I love about the Atlas of the Heart is she talks about the emotions in terms of a world map of an atlas and the places we go to in our minds, depending on what's going on in our lives. And she frames anxiety like this. She says it's an intolerance for uncertainty. She describes anxiety in that kind of terms. We want certainty and we can't always get it. And so that's something to bear in mind, that our life isn't certain. We don't know what's going to happen later this afternoon, never mind tomorrow. And so, we have to be, to use that common phrase, mindful of what's going on, in the here and now. So being honest with ourselves, asking ourselves about who's in control here is a really important question to address. And it comes back to priorities, comes back to who do we put first? Seek God's kingdom first and his righteousness, and all those things will line up. We won't always know how, but for sure God is a God who is faithful, and he will recognise that for us and honour us in that. So what we really need to remember is who it is we are worshipping this morning. We recognise that God is a God of faithfulness, for sure. He's a God that we put our trust in, who recognises that we need connection with him and with those around us. If there's no trust, there is no connection. So questions like, where do we put our trust are important questions to ask ourselves. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I'm aware of the fact I've talked for a while now. But as an exercise, it might be helpful in the days ahead to have a look at a couple of chapters in Matthew that follow on from the Sermon on the Mount. Because in Matthew 8 and 9, you have a really interesting sort of like set of accounts of stories. We know that, that Jesus was doing a lot of teaching at this point. But he meets with lots of different individuals during the course of Matthew 8 and Matthew 9. And as I was going through this, I recognised that actually the interactions Jesus was having were with people that were anxious. They were anxious about different things. So, for example, if you go to Matthew 8 and verses 1 to 3, you read of somebody who was an ostracised leper, somebody who was very much shunned by their community, dealing with some really serious stuff. That person was anxious. The centurion ruler was concerned about, a person in his household who was dying. You think about Peter's mother-in-law, who was undergoing very serious illness, very serious physical discomfort. You then go on to read about people that were spiritually oppressed. We read about people who have concerns over financial security, spiritual warfare, a loss of reputation, the suffering of a child, permanent disability. All of those things make us anxious. Why not? But it's really interesting to see that Jesus doesn't just kind of give us a very sort of like, trite expression and doesn't address. He does address. He addresses the concerns we have, the things that make us anxious. And so, I would commend to you those passages to look through. They're not antidotes to ignore feelings. They address feelings for sure. And Jesus is concerned about our self-care. And just as I come to kind of towards conclusion today, I just wanted to say something about Sabbath rest. because Sabbath rest is something that I think our society has jettisoned. It's forgotten about it. Okay, people do rest during the week, for sure. There are people that find ways of getting rest. But I do think that it's important for us as people of faith to recognise the gift of Sabbath. And there are many of us here can remember when shops didn't open, when Sunday was different, when it was set aside. And even when we think about why shops didn't open, well, actually, I think there was an issue of justice there. It's important that people have rest time, but now it's very difficult. The lines are blurred. And no longer is Sunday trading something that is, for everybody to rest, but it's seen as a norm. We can go out to Westfield for sure today, and it'll be probably one of the busiest days of the week. But it is important to recognise rest. And I found something really helpful. There's a writer who has written a really interesting book about rest and about Sabbath. And the book's entitled The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. I like that. It's by a person called John Mark Comer. And what they've done is they've actually kind of written a list here, which I found really, really helpful. And I connect this with Sabbath for sure, because that often can be our default setting. On the right-hand side, the relentlessness, the busyness, the hurry, the noise, the isolation, crowds, distraction, envy and confusion can often be our default setting. That relentlessness. And there's something about a principle of Sabbath, which is not just about the one day of the week, but it's about a principle of life. It's about being in a space, in a place where we can actually default much more to this setting, which is looking at restfulness. And so I think this is a really helpful sort of way of looking at, the topic on anxiety. Because if you notice there, the list goes on. It's not like it's ignoring the stuff that is actually happening in our everyday life. It's within a principle of Sabbath keeping, which is about living our lives, which is talking about, what are our motivations for life itself. And we work from a place of love, and we see work as contribution rather than consumption and accumulation and accomplishment. And there's something about the Sabbath principle which actually brings us back to a reality, and sort of putting in principles that actually, help us to live not in a hurried state all the time. For sure, there's going to be times where we are going to be hurried and we have a lot on. But I think there's something about this which is really helpful. And where does anxiety fit in here? Well, it's not it kind of talking about opposites here, but we're talking about it being framed in terms of peace. Actually, that's, we go to the God of peace to help us with our anxiety. And so I think this is a really helpful way of looking at this concept of anxiety, that we are to be people that are restful people. We are to be people that, and I love that. I can't get enough of that. The whole idea that's something that I think about in the course of my daily living is so important. It's putting our priorities. Jesus delights in our presence. He doesn't delight in our accomplishments. He wants us to be faithful for sure, but he wants us to go on a journey with him, which is to delight in his creation, to be restful in his creation and not restless, and not constrained by all these things that enslave us at the end of the day. And so I found that really, really helpful. So, anxiety is something not to be feared. It's something that we can learn a lot about ourselves from. It is a fundamental part of many of our daily livings. But we need a bit of a paradigm shift. We need a shift which helps us to see actually that we're not individual entities walking around disconnected, but we are connected. And I just want to end this morning by reminding ourselves from John 15 of our place on the vine. Jesus says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me as I remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. And so when I think about anxiety, I think about the work that God continues to do in me and in us in terms of those things that we struggle with with our mental health. I pray that we would remain in the vine, remain in him, because he leads to life and fullness of life. I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.